A couple of years ago I was sitting at the clubhouse watching the golfers coming in. A man came and sat beside me, a nice chap, and we had a chat about this, that and the other, and he was asking did I belong to Lossie and various things. And then, just as he was about to go away, because his wife had turned up, he said, "It must have been marvellous for you growing up here with a golf course and the beach." And she collected him and he went off. Before I had time to say to him, well, the only time that I was on the golf course when I was young was on a Sunday afternoon when we went for a walk along the golf course, dressed in our best clothes, white shirts, navy blue suits, black shoes, polished. And the beach, we didn't go on the beach very often unless there was something happening. I don't think we liked sand very much. No, where we grew up really was the rocks and the harbour. The beach had huts for visitors, and I can remember when there were entertainments on the beach. I think it was one of the chocolate companies ran an entertainment where there was a sandcastle competition, and there was a very large ball, like about 6 foot diameter, and the game was to push one way or the other, score goals. The other thing that happened on the beach, although I can only remember seeing it once, was motorcycle rallies. You can't have them now, of course, because we've still got the stubs of the anti-glider poles sticking up, so it wouldn't be safe to do. No, where we spent our time really was the rocks, and just a couple of 100 yards along from the beach. Favourite place really was the Hythe. There were pools there that we could hunt for crabs, hunt for wee fishes, which we would catch and lay out as though they were for the market. And then when it came to time to go home, we just left them, so that was a present for the gows. There were pools that were lovely to work on because you had sloping bits, and you could have bits where you could stand and you could sail boaties and whatever. The rocks also had great attraction because we could light fires there without getting into trouble. You just collected enough of the wood that had drifted in and started a fire, and while you were doing that, somebody else was away collecting buckies, getting limpets. The buckies you had to boil. You got a tin, half filled with buckies, and topped it up with seawater, and then boiled it. And then you let it go back down, and you boiled it again, and then you let it go back down, and you boiled it again. That was three froths. And later on I discovered that's what they do commercially. They give it 3 froths. So I don't know how they learned, but we must have learned from somebody. Limpets, we used to fry limpets. You'd get a piece of tin, put that on and put the limpet on, and of course when it died the shell became detached, and you scraped off the gut and then chewed the limpet and chewed and chewed and chewed. I don't know whether they were good for our stomachs or for our nutrition, but they were certainly good for our jaw muscles. And the rocks were a dumping place at that time. Anybody who had something they wanted rid of, an old mattress, took it down, threw it over the rocks. Bedsteads thrown over the rocks, bicycles that had buckled wheels, they were thrown over the rocks. But also from the fish sheds there was guts thrown over the rocks, so it's not surprising that we had rats down there as well, and every so often we would have a rat hunt. I seem to remember rat hunts being organised by a fella called Johnny Raw. Johnny had severe educational difficulties, but when it came to money, he didn't do too badly, because we firmly believed, and I suspected it may even have been true, that Johnny got 6pence per tail for the rats that we killed. You just stand there, build a fire, the smoke would go down the rocks, the rats would come out, and you'd just pelt them with stones. I don't remember actually ever hitting them. I was never very good at that kind of thing. Maybe I didn't try terribly hard. One of the other things I remember Johnny organising, it must have been during the war, was metal collection, because scrap iron was needed to feed the furnaces to build the tanks. So again, I suspect that there was some money involved in it, and Johnny got a little bit of return from it. Going back to the beach, the only bit where we got very involved in sand was in Sleepy Valley. This was a genuine valley of about 50 yards long, about 10 yards wide, just at the side of the 17th hole. And the boys, the apprentices, the 16, 17 year olds, would stay there in tents. You would either own a tent, which was unlikely, or rent a tent from Willie Cormack. I think he charged £0.50 a week for a bell tent. Bell tents were all the rage at one stage. And they would stay there and cycle into work, walk into work for an 8 o'clock start. So it was a strange kind of existence, but they had a lot of fun together, and it never caught on after the war. What we did when I was big enough to do this was we had a very similar scheme out at the gate into the lighthouse. It's now a builder's yard, but what we had there was again a bell tent, and boys living there. The girls came out on Sundays and occasionally on nights during the week to see that we were all right. I was a kind of junior member then, so Big Brother tolerated me, but I had to be careful, and I had to go and fetch water. Fetching water involved going down the side of the lighthouse dyke into the shed at the bottom of the slope, getting the water and carrying it all the way back up. I suppose it must have been like half a mile maybe, so more than a quarter of a mile, less than half a mile. We dug holes, of course, for the obvious other fluid arrangements, and we really enjoyed ourselves then. There would be cooking of a sort. Sometimes folk would bring out mince. One of the songs that I wrote a while ago, the chorus was mince and tatties mixed with sun, and stewed tea with sour milk in the morning. Because milk, of course, didn't keep then, and we'd no way of making it last longer with fridges or so on. The other place where we spent our time was the harbour, and we would maybe go there in the morning, but the truth was that in my day, in the harbour, there was almost invariably a boat in for some kind of refurbishment. Sometimes our own boat would be there, sometimes a relative boat, because we all had relatives. I mean, they were family boats, so if your own boat wasn't there, your uncle's boat might be in. And we would help there. We'd run messages, collect the stores, clean the wheelhouse windows. I can remember cleaning the wheelhouse windows in the Windsor, my cousin George's boat, and using a newspaper. I'd been shown how to fold a newspaper so that you didn't leave marks on the window. Cleaning inside and out. We'd be sent sometimes up. I remember being sent up to James E. Peterkin's. He was the sailmaker, block and tackle maker, and also ship's chandler. and a travel agent as well. And what you did there was you go up and I would say, sweat rags for the briar, and in the corner there will be several different bags of rags, sweat rags to us, sweat rags, and you'd be given a bundle of them which you would clutch to your bosom and go back down to the boat, trying not to lose too many. The other thing you would be sent up for would be some ale. You'd get a 5-gallon drum of oil. Shell, I seem to remember supplying most of it, Shell mixed. And you'd be sent up with a can, and it would be filled up for you from the Briar's can. And a solemn note made to add that to your bill. The other thing that we enjoyed doing, a strange thing to enjoy doing, was pumping the bilges. I think it was because you had the feeling you were contributing something, because it was pretty smelly. The bilges were always full of smelly water. But we felt that we were making some kind of contribution to the boat. At 4 o'clock, 3:30, 4 o'clock, the boats would be coming in, and we would be up beside the Brander Arms at the top of the market, identifying the boats as they became dots on the horizon, and we could identify boats miles out, and also estimate to 5 minutes how long it would take them to get in. Nowadays I can hardly see the water, never mind recognise a boat on it. But at the market, you would be down there and you would be first to catch the rope thrown ashore to tie up the boat. Usually you would give it to an old manny. Must have been 40 or 50, some of these old men. And the old man would put it round the pole, the pile, to tie up. And then you would try to catch the rope for the guy rope that was thrown to pull in the boxes as the skipper hoisted them with the winch. Generally speaking, when we were little, we weren't allowed to do the guy, because the boxes were quite heavy and you could easily picture somebody being pulled in. I never knew anybody to be pulled in, because we had the sense to let go if it looked like working that way. And of course what we would want to do is to get aboard the boat and get a hurl round to the old harbour, from the market round to the old harbour. Best part of 5 minutes, but you felt you were really going to sea then, particularly if the skipper put on the knifes in the engine and you went round the corner. At the end of the market, of course, the men would be going home. But you would be sent home first with a fry, maybe half dozen haddocks or flukes. My Uncle John liked grugnards, and skate, so it might be a bit of that to take home. And the idea was that we would have that home so that by the time he was cleared up and going home, the tea would be nearly ready for him. The other thing that we did down at the harbour was catch gerrichs. I don't think I ever found out what the proper name for gerrichs are. Small fish, about 3 inches long, and sometimes accompanied by saithes, which were very similar in build and about 9 inches long, and very occasionally mackerel. If you caught a mackerel, gee, you felt like somebody really important. So catching gerrichs was something, and the various places where you could do it in relative safety, one of them being the wee slippy. That was really the favourite, because you could get near the water there. The other places, if you were fishing off the pier, you had like about 6, 8, 10 feet of space before the line reached the water. Something on television recently showed boys about to go and do this. It was a kid-on shot. And they had their lines attached to poles. We never used poles. You fished with your bare hands, and a hook which you had bought from Geordie McBain, the cycle agent. Occasionally you'd buy them from Cormac, but Cormac was a grumly brute, so you never bought things from him unless Geordie had run out of them. You then got a length of twine and tied the hook on, and there were special knots that you had to use to make sure it didn't slip off if, in the unlikely event of you catching a mackerel. We watched men working down there, of course. You watched men on the slip. You waited for a chance to watch the slip being pulled up and then for the boat to be allowed back down again. Slip has vanished entirely now, and all trace of the slip has gone. We used to watch the smithy in Dunn's shed. The rest of the shed you didn't actually see very much because he tended to be shooed away from the lathes and so on that were there. All incidentally worked from a steam engine with pulleys and belts and clutches for the belts. I liked to watch the smith shoeing horses. Didn't know much about horses apart from the number of legs that they had, but the one thing he could do was recognise the smell of the horse's hoof being burnt as the shoe was tried on it. So he used to stand and watch there. Gillespie, I think. Bully Gillespie, I think. I don't think we bothered with names for most of the men. They weren't that important to us. The other thing I liked to watch was the wood coming out of the steam chest. At the side of the slip there was a steam chest, and the boat builders would put in a length of wood and leave it in steam for long enough to soak right through, and then it could be bent into shape, and a shape which it retained. So that was something worth watching. But remember that we spent our time down there for a fairly simple reason. There was no reason for us to stay at home. At home the house would be cold because there would only be one fire, and in the poorer houses the fire would be used for cooking. Us rich fishers by then had electric cookers, so mothers cooked on electricity. Never had gas. Didn't get gas in Lossie until about 1995, I think it came. And you didn't spend time at home because there was nothing to do. You didn't have toys. If you might have books, and you could certainly get books from the library. Also, getting books from the library involved a bit of a struggle. First time that I went to the library, I went through, and the door had a squeaky spring on it, so you couldn't enter silently. So I went in, and the librarian, Davy Peary, leapt on me, as he did on everybody. It wasn't just me. And he said, "What do you want?" And I said, "I want a book." "What book do you want on?" "On a cane." "Well, it's nice coming here if you don't ken what you want. You'd better go and have a look." He was all right, really. But I don't think he had much in the way of salesmanship or customer training. He ran the library, and he also ran the town hall, so that when the pictures were going to be on, there was no cinema in Lossie till 1939, and he ran the cinema and put out the seats. I think it was benches in the cheap seats, and then other seats. But if I went when I was young, I was usually taken by my guardian. I was brought up by an aunt and uncle, and they quite liked the pictures, and we would go upstairs where the seats were fixed and very nearly padded. Look at them now, you think, oh, I don't want to sit too long in that. So that was the town hall. I have a feeling that before the war there was a cannon lay just where the telephone kiosk is now, but I could be wrong. It might have been that was where the anchor lay. But there was definitely something lay out there. We would be at the market, of course, for the selling of the fish, and you'd listen to the salesman going, what am I, what? I never understood a word, but they would finish up with the buyers going around and slapping on their tickets on the various boxes that they had bought, and the boxes would be taken over to the side and loaded onto the carts. The carts would trundle up the hill, around the corner, and go along to the fish sheds. I can remember one very large fish being loaded onto the cart, and it was 100 weight and a quarter, so somebody can work out how many kilograms that is. One of the things I can remember, I always think it's strange, the things that stick in your memory, that for a while on going down to the harbour, I used to go in to meet my friend Jimmy Main, Mickey Main, in Argyle Street, and if I went in there on my way down, this would be 9 o'clock in the morning, whatever, his mother always gave us a sheave of loaf with butter and jam on. The dame was just a shore worker, so the father, and I don't think they could have had very much in the way of money, but she always gave the loonies a sheave of loaf, a slice of loaf, which must have been an item to consider in her weekly shop. Sundays were quite different. On Sundays you went to the kirk. 10:30 the first bell sounded, and you were getting ready then, your best suit and hat, not a hat, sorry, a suit, a white shirt, and for years what I had was a white shirt and the collar out over the top of the jacket, and of course when young I had shorts and stockings, 3/4 hose I think they were called. So the bell would go at 10:30, and we would be getting ready, and at 11:15 you'd set out for the kirk, arriving at 10:02, and go and sit in your seat and contemplate, wait for the minister to arrive. Same again, 5:30 for the 6 o'clock service. The service I would sit through, age 5, 6, 7, 8, and at the end of the service, the children went up the stairs into the hall for the Sunday school, and then you went home. I think it was half an hour of Sunday school. And I can remember that one of my jobs when I went home was to dash down to Jimmy Ross's, now the Co-op shoppy in Queen Street, and get the Sunday papers and get the Sunday Post. What I don't think I realised until fairly recently was that the Sunday Post was, at that time, I'm speaking about like 1935, 36, the Sunday Post was still a fairly recent invention, because it had only caught on just round about 1930. During the week we got the Press and Journal. I used to be sent down a doon and get the Free Press, because the journal was the Aberdeen Free Press and Journal, amalgamated many years earlier. The Sunday school you went to for a number of years, and then when you became older you would go to the Bible class. Although by then the numbers tended to thin out because the Bible class was kind of heavy going, because it was a bit like going to the school. In the Sunday school you sometimes got games and things like that, but in the Bible class you did big league reading bits of the Bible. The minister was Mr. Henry. He used to speak about brotherly love, but never seemed to demonstrate any. He may have been a nice man for all I know, but I never saw traces of it. He used to visit in the afternoons. He'd go round his various parishioners. I can remember him coming and visiting. He had a bike. He used to cycle down to Union Street where I lived and come in, put his bike up against the dike, and I would go out because I didn't want to hear him, and I would play with the cyclometer on his bike. This was a little counting thingy that counted the number of turns off his front wheel. So I would turn it a few extra or put in a few negative ones. I don't know whether he really kept account of all the cycling that he did, but if he did, then the days he came to visit us, they were incorrect. He was a man of considerable authority, Mr. Henry, and a powerful preacher, and I only once heard him countered. He was giving a sermon which I think was on the instructions of Edinburgh, to tell people to beware of the Masons, the Freemasons, because they must have done something to upset the system. So he was halfway through this when Willie Bruce, who sat directly opposite us, we sat up the stairs in the kirk, in the ledges, and Willie Bruce, directly opposite us, stood up and said, and I can picture him doing it, Willie said, "Mr. Henry, there are as many good men in the Masons as there are in the kirk." And he walked out of the kirk. I can't remember what Mr. Henry did. I suspect he went on preaching and ignored Willie. So there we are. Eventually I finished up in the choir, but that wasn't till I was much older. The organ was played at that time by Bert Lovett, who was an expert organist. He was married to a cousin of mine, and they lived up in Elgin. The organ required air to be pumped through to it, and this was done up in the hall in a little cupboard, and it was done by the son of the beadle. Beadle was Willie Main, what do they call it in English? Sexton? Something like that. And Josie used to come every Sunday and pump that, and I don't know whether he got paid for it or a wallop in the lug if he didn't. He would miss the cue occasionally. Bert had a bell push, so he pressed that when he wanted pump, because the thing was quite at some distance away. The hall had been built on to the back of the kirk and was used for anything which was non-religious, like soirees. I liked soirees. I don't know how many there were, but in a soiree there would be people who would sing and people who would recite poetry, and I've got a feeling there were even people who told stories and jokes. I'm not quite sure how that accorded with Mr. Henry. Mr. Henry gave my Aunt Janet, my guardian, who was president of the Women's Guild right through the war, they gave her a telling off for having a raffle for a cake, which I think wasn't really a raffle. I think you had to guess the number of currants or the weight of the cake or something like that. And she was told off that this was gambling and was on a way to perdition. The big event, as far as I was concerned at the time, was the picnic. Sunday school picnic, when you would go up there, and you always had to take a mug, if I remember rightly. Take your own mug, and a bus would come, several buses would come, and you'd get aboard a bus and you'd go miles and miles and miles away into the country to a place called Gillybogs, which turned out to be just beside Langbride, right beside the bowling green in Langbride, and was about maybe 4 miles out of Lossie. But we felt we were really in the country. You couldn't see the sea, so it must be the country. There we had races, and some of the men would have gone up earlier and lit fires so that there was hot water for tea, and you might even get something hot like a pie or whatever. And it was a great day, and you would come back really exhausted at the end of it. I don't remember anything terribly specific about the earlier ones, but in the last one that I ever went to, when I must have been like 15 or so, I remember us getting on the bus and singing, "Mares, dotes and does, dotes and little lambs, divey, at giddly tidy too, wouldn't you?" So if you Google that, you'll find out what year it was that I went to my last Sunday school picnic. But they were great outings. They were really big social events, because we didn't have social events really. Listening to the radio was quite an exciting social event. When I was 5, of course, I started at the school, 1st of September 1936. We started the school, went up to the school and were greeted by Miss Forsyth. Lovely lady, kind. She would have been kind to us, Miss Forsyth, if we'd let her. But I don't think we were into letting people be kind to us. We didn't know how to do it. So I remember going up the first day and taking with me a buttery roly, and having the roly up in Miss Forsyth's. And from then on, of course, I went up by myself. I used to always stop at Willie Christie's, the builder. Willie had retired from building by then, and sadly Willie was to go on and lose 2 sons during the war. But at this time before the war, Willie spent a lot of his time in a little workshop that he had built at the side of the house. And he tied flies for anglers, and I used to love to watch him doing this. It was a real precision job, although at that time, well even now, I don't really understand anglers, because they're people who catch fish one at a time. Couldn't see the point of catching fish one at a time. If you hadn't a box full, what was the point? Anyway, I used to stand and watch him doing this fly tying, and then run the rest of the way up past Miss Forsyth's, across what used to be Jimmy Gordon's field. Jimmy Gordon grew neeps, turnips, and when the time came, we would steal a turnip and cut it open and take out the bit and try to eat it and throw the bits away, but eventually turn the turnip into a lantern for Halloween. I can't picture us doing much else. Occasionally people would try and get us to look for apples or something like that, but it was a celebration that never seemed to catch on terribly well. So up to the school, and as we went up there, School Hill Terrace was just being built. My brother eventually lived in School Hill Terrace and had a lovely house there. He left it to come down to the family house in Union Street and said that was a big mistake because it wasn't nearly such a nice house. He was up there with a beautiful view over the river and the Lake of Moray. Anyway, we went up there, School Hill Terrace, just being built and going along there. As we went there, we passed the old reservoir, or reservoir as we called it. The old reservoir was a steel tank which must have been about 30 feet high maybe, and similar kind of diameter riveted steel on a base of granite blocks, which was open underneath, so that you could go in and walk round underneath and cut through to the various bits. You had to be very careful when you did it, because it was a convenient place for those caught short by the demands of nature. So you had to watch your feet and maybe watch them when you come out as well. It was destroyed, I think, soon after these houses were completed. One of our class got a house there, Boy Donaldson, and he lived there the rest of the time that he was at the school. My friend Campbell Thompson's parents were having a bungalow built as I was going to the school, Killoran, at the top of Kimberley Street and James Street. So I used to always call in there on the way home to see how the builders had got on. And again, just to emphasise, these were our entertainments. These were our points of interest, that you went to do something like that. And if you were lucky, you might find there was a joiner there who would let you hammer in a nail or two for them. So it doesn't quite come up to an iPad for entertainment, but we enjoyed ourselves doing it anyway. At the school, I think the truth was I liked the school. You weren't allowed to say that, of course, because if you'd said it, you would probably have been dumped. And Miss Forsyth was really a lovely person who tried to make us all welcome. I seem to remember we got Horlicks for the morning interval. So I don't know whether I made that up or not, but Horlicks seems quite right. I definitely remember that we had a band and I played the triangle. And I feel that I made a good job of playing the triangle. But that was the only music that I ever took part in all the way through the school, well, apart from singing. But Dr. Jessup seemed to have the desire to keep the school as simple as possible. So he didn't encourage anything as far as I could see. I don't know whether he really encouraged education, never mind enjoying yourself. In the babies, we got drill. Miss Forsyth would take us for drill, and she stood in the middle of the hall, and we ran round and round and round and round and round. I don't remember us doing anything else apart from running round and round and round and round. Maybe somebody will tell me. When you went outside to play, one of the reasons you would go outside was if you said, "Please may I leave the room, miss?" So that you could go to the toilets. Well, when first we started, you could cut straight through from the door of the infant part through to the toilet. But while we were there, they started to build an extension, and that meant you couldn't do that. You had to go right the way around, and I suspect there were quite a few accidents happened to trousers, knickers on the way round, because it was just too far by the time you decided that you would dare to ask to be allowed out. They built the new block, and I can remember the masons building the stonework of the block, and it wasn't until it was being demolished that I realised it had been a steel frame building with stone cladding. I don't remember the steel work at all, but maybe that was because the steel work had gone up while we were on holiday. But I remember the masons, because you could speak to them. They worked in such a way that there were always some of them there that you could speak to. Quite soon, I think it was the following winter, the new block was opened, and the following winter there was a storm, and the roof lifted off and lay down in the girls' playground as neat as you would like. Didn't cause any damage to anything else, didn't cause terribly much damage to the block that it came off. And on the next few mornings after that, we had to line up to get ready to come in, and we lined up beside the girls' toilets, and then we came in 2 by 2, walking very carefully round the side of this flat roof that was occupying the girls' playground. I don't remember it going back on. Maybe it was done during the holidays. Playing outside, we had a grassy patch. The sad thing about the grassy patch was it was roughly 45 degrees to the horizontal, so I'm not aware that anybody was ever hurt by tumbling right down to the bottom and bumping into the wall, but there must have been people who did that. I can remember us standing at the bottom of that slope watching the tarry boiler doing the school bray, and it occurs to me now that it was almost certainly the first tarry coating that the bray got, because in the 20s they were doing the main roads with tar, and there were men employed to break up the stones and make the basis for the road. I remember us going to the coronation down at the square. We've actually got a photograph of kids marching there. It's not our class because the coronation had been put off. If King Edward VII hadn't abdicated, then that photograph would have had our class at the very front. But it was the following summer before we had the coronation, and a new class had started, and they were at the front there, walking along beside the provost, Peter Bow, Peter Smith, and led by Miss Forsyth and quite likely Miss MacLeod as well. When we got to the square, we all lined up there, and we got a chocolate medal, which we proceeded to eat, and then presumably we had races and things, and then went home with our faces covered in chocolate. The following week in the paper I discovered a few years ago when I was looking in the library, there was a letter from somebody saying it would have been much better if the bairns had been given a hot pie instead of chocolate, because chocolate was not good for them. So I don't know whether it was a butcher or a baker who had written in to say that we should get a pie. Just at the beginning of, just before the war, the government requisitioned several of the farms to the west of the town, including Smithfield Farm. And that was quite a serious problem for me, because I had just then got myself allowed to help with the delivery of milk. Eddie Phillips, who had Smithfield Farm, had a truck, which was unusual because usually it was horse and cart, but Eddie had this truck, came in and delivered milk mainly, I think, to Stotfield and Branderborough. And some of the houses in Stotfield were back from the road, number of yards. And my job at the age of, what would I have been, 7 or 8, would be to take the milk and run up there and put it on the step. At the end of the day, when we had finished delivering, it'd be early morning, I think. It might just have been school holidays I did it. You would get a half pint of milk to yourself. So that was your pay. None of this money stuff at all. But Smithfield Farm was one of the ones that was requisitioned by the Air Force. And that was on the 1st of January 1938. So take note, it was 1938, long before the war started. Nearly 2 full years. And from then on, they started to build the aerodrome to be ready for what was obviously coming, the war. I can remember being out there helping to build the the aerodrome, because I knew that this bad man called Hitler had to be beaten. So we were getting ready to beat Hitler. And the bit that I can remember so clearly was pulling out tree roots just beside where the WAF encampment is. You recognise it by the barbed wire around it. Keep them in, I think. So the irony is that we pulled out all these tree roots. The trees had been cut down, and we pulled out all these tree roots. And you probably had an axe. Somebody had an axe who would cut through the roots, and you pulled them out, and then you could take them home. So I'm not sure whether it was beating Hitler or having something to burn on the fire that was more important. The irony of it is, of course, that there's been pine trees planted in exactly the same spot, so that they are now 20 feet tall, filling the space where I had worked so hard. But we did beat Hitler, so I'm not sure just how big a part I played in that. With the coming of the aerodrome, of course, some of the more astute people saw a money-making opportunity and decided to build a cinema. And that was the Regal Cinema, now Grampian Furnishers. And that was built 1938-39, and it opened in 1939 with a film called Dawn Patrol, with Errol Flynn in the leading role. I think that it was one of the relatively few films with no women in it. And looking back on it, I think it was actually an anti-war film, because it was pointing out the stupidity of all these men being killed and having a terrible time in the process of doing it, and Errol Flynn having to take over in the end when he'd been the rebel all the way through, and he was going to have to be in charge of sending young men out to their deaths. So it'd be interesting to watch the film again and picture whether it was important in terms of anti-war. But a very few weeks after that picture, on the 1st of August 1939, we were down at the harbour watching a couple of planes doing what we knew was called stooging, because the planes would be flying around, flipping over, running after each other, and there were two out stooging over the bay when one ran into the tail of the other. And I can still picture the bits falling off. I've been told since that they were both Oxford aeroplanes. One had two people in, and the other had one pilot in. And they were the first of the trainees, of course, and they were the first of the trainees to be killed. But they weren't the last, because between that day and the day that the RAF left Lossie, which was September 1945, just after the end of the war. The RAF left and the Navy came in. But in that time, 385, I think it was, RAF pilots, gunners, wireless operators were killed training. Not fighting the enemy, but just training. And if you go up to the cemetery in Lossie, you'll find a number of them buried up there. Local men could be sent to their own area for burying, but we have quite a number of Canadians. We have Germans there from the first raid, and that was the outcome of that. We used to go to the pictures, and it changed 3 times a week, and we went 3 times a week, probably Monday, Wednesday and Saturday. And there was a more or less continuous queue for the pictures. You went down there and you started queuing at 6 o'clock to get in at 6:30. and the first house ran, and then a second house ran at 8:30, and there was probably a queue for that out there as well. The people who owned it must have coined the money. When you got inside, you would also spend some of your money on ice cream. El Dorado, it was called, the ice cream, and you got a little tub of ice cream, and you used the top. You took the lid off, bent it over, and used it as a scoop to eat the ice cream. I suspect it was never very hygienic, but then we were probably stronger than most of the bugs that were there. I don't remember how much we paid to get in early on. I think it was 3 for the matinee on a Saturday. There was a matinee on the Saturday afternoon, and I used to go to that regularly. And for a while I used to have to take my cousins Helene and Sandra, but by going there I got my entry money as well, so I saved my own 3, probably wasted it on ice cream. But for a while, towards the end of the war, I used to get a shilling on a Saturday, 5p. And getting into the pictures at that time was 8p for the front row. And when you came out, you had 4p in your pocket, and we went, and having queued to get into the pictures, we then went across to the chip shop and queued up again to get a fish supper, which cost the remaining 4p, 3p, old pence for the fish, and a penny worth of chips. So a few years ago, I went for a fish supper, 4 or 5 years ago. I went for a fish supper and it cost £4, so that was 240 times the price of the one that I used to get. The chip shop was quite important. There was no such things as curries and rubbish like that. With men coming back from the services who brought the idea of curries eventually, because in the army you just used curry to hide the taste of the meat, which had probably gone off. One of the things that you could get at that time, and it came back into vogue a few years ago, was a bully dip. This was a lump of corned beef smothered in batter and cooked there, and you ate that with your fingers. I can remember being given one by my brother Peter out of the back of Johnny Ralph's fish shop. Peter was the oldest of our family, and after my mother died, he did a lot of the mothering and trying to keep everything together. Remember, my father was at sea from 4 o'clock in the morning till 5 o'clock at night. So things were quite difficult, and we would have a girl come in, or we would have my aunts come in, and eventually my father remarried, by which time there wasn't a problem, because my brother John and I had both gone to aunts, and the others were bigger. Helen was 13, I think, and Jim would have been 14, 15, Peter was 17, and the year after that they started recruiting for the Air Force, and he was one of the first volunteers. So he joined the Air Force as soon as he was 18. But I remember Peter and the bully dip, and I can also picture Peter on an ice cream trike across beside the clubhouse. He couldn't take the trike onto the brae down to the beach because Bill MacLeod had the concession, which involved nobody else being allowed to sell ice cream from the top of the brae down to on the beach. During the war, we had people living up the stair. The house consisted really of 2 flats, one downstairs and the other upstairs, which was rented out, let out during the summer to visitors. We used to have a Dr. Keir came from Galashiels every summer and spent a month in Lossie, because he was a golfer and his son was learning to be a golfer as well. So quite often it was because people were golfers. But once the war was imminent, from like the beginning of 1939, there were a lot of airmen came, and some of them were reservists being called up, and they had families, so the families would come as well. And we had a family living up the stair from 1939 until well into the Navy time. Oh, in fact, they were still living there when I was a student, so 1956, I think, was the last of the upstairs people. And they had a flat to themselves, although quite often it was a fairly limited thing. The drawback was that they had the bathroom, so that once a month I was sent up there for a bath. Once a month was plenty. We weren't that dirty, really. I have to smile now. My son has a shower every morning before he goes to work, and his work is clean, so he doesn't actually need one next day either. But that's how things are nowadays. But we had a succession of people, really nice couples. David from Dunfermline. I remember going down to look for David because he'd gone down for a haircut to Willie Youngson's, and hours later he still wasn't back, and I was sent down to check if he was all right. So I had to knock at the door, and Willie came to the door, and I said, "I'm looking for a man to see if he's all right." Willie says, "Fozzie." I said, "There's an airman called David. What does he look like?" "Oh," I said, "he's getting a bit bald on top." So that meant that David and I were never really friends after that. We had Bert from Grangemouth. I remember Bert. And the funny thing was that years later, Bert's niece was the secretary in the personnel department when I worked at BP Chemicals in Grangemouth. We had the Maxwell, Eddie Maxwell, and the ladies were always known as Mrs. The men were known by the first name. So Eddie used to drive Queen Mary's, the big articulated lorry that carried bits of aeroplanes around the world. And he used to come home in the Queen Mary sometimes, and I would get to sit in the cab with him. That was big league, that, getting to sit in the cab of a Queen Mary. I never was in it when it moved. Towards the end of the war, there was a terrible accident when a Wellington crashed into a house at Church Street and killed Joey Flood and her 5 sons, and the people next door, Edith Allen and Vera Grant. And their coffins were carried from the service on a Queen Mary up to the cemetery to be buried. We also had other people who came in, and I discovered a photograph recently, and I looked at it and I said, "That's Taffy, Taffy." Taffy used to come for, certainly 3 years, 4 years probably. He was a corporal in the RAF, and he and his mate Geordie, who was from the northeast of England, the two of them used to come, go to the evening service at the kirk with us, having had their tea with us beforehand, and they would stay from, like maybe arrive 4 o'clock and stay till 9 o'clock when the news came on. And so that was another of our contributions. We hoped that somebody would be doing similar things for our own people. My brother Peter had been killed by this time. My brother Jim was out in the Mediterranean. My sister Helen was down in Somerset in the ATS. So we hoped that people would look after them the way that we looked after Taffy and Geordie. Later on we had the Navy people staying with us. There were no married quarters, of course, at that time. Didn't have married quarters until well into the Navy time, which must have been the best part of 1960 before any quarters were built. And then eventually the Navy left and the RAF came in and built quarters, which were absolute crap, and were upgraded about 3 times when I was watching, so I don't know how many other times. But they were clearly designed for the south of England or the Mediterranean or somewhere, and were not suitable for a Lossie winter. The other thing during the war was that we helped to do anything that was going on. I can remember helping carry blankets up to the stores where I now live. So we carried these blankets up because the soldiers were arriving there, and there was nowhere for the soldiers to go because they hadn't built anywhere. They'd built quarters out in the aerodrome, but nothing for the soldiers at that time. So they were plonked wherever they could. Church halls. Church halls. I remember Mr. Henry dashing from the pulpit one time to go out and upbraid some soldiers who had come in, were making a noise, going tackety boots up the stairway. So this was him and his brotherly love. But they never did it again, so I suppose it worked. Anyway, we were taking these blankets up to the store, and one of the soldiers said, "If you take all these blankets up, we'll give you a sixpence." So we put all the blankets up. There was a lot of blankets because there were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stores, I think, upstairs, and the soldiers did the downstairs and we did the upstairs. And would you believe it that at the end of that time, when we'd shifted all these blankets, covered in dust, coughing and sneezing, we couldn't find the man who'd promised a sixpence. And to this day, when I go out in the morning, the first thing that I do is look round and see if there's a soldier there with a sixpence. And I've been unlucky so far. But the other things that we would do, you did anything that, this was diversion. This was a change from what you were doing. I can remember us helping to build the anti-tank blocks on the West Beach. They were built largely by Welsh pioneers, the Pioneer Corps chunkies. They were the sort of low-grade soldiers, and in 1940, in October 1940, when we were expecting to be invaded by the Germans at any moment. In fact, we weren't, because the Germans didn't win the Battle of Britain. They gave up, and then in October it was too late to sail across from Holland in flat-bottom barges. We had things up here in case they came in flat-bottom barges from Hamburg. I think they'd have been pretty glad to be ashore if they had. But the blocks were made by men having formers, and they would put the formers down and pour concrete in. They would borrow the concrete from what's now the caravan site, where a big hole had been dug to get gravel to make the concrete. And men wheelbarrowed, a lot of wheelbarrowing. A lot of wheelbarrowing went on. What they did